Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on 5G as a growth engine, how do telco IT systems need to evolve. I'd like to welcome all of our attendees and to start with I will just run through some logistics. So you are all in listen only mode, but if you do need to contact us at any point throughout the presentation, then please just type a comment in the box which should be indicated on the screen in a second. We'd also like to encourage you to ask questions for our presenters and panelists throughout the session using that same chat box. We will do our very best to respond to your questions during the live Q&A, which will be towards the end of the session. But if we don't have a chance to get to your question, then we will get back to you with a summary at the end, where we hope to address most of the questions that we get. We will also be sharing around a recording of the session as well as the accompanying slides, and would encourage you to share with any colleagues you think might be interested but who couldn't join today, so that they'll be able to view offline. And finally, if you are on Twitter, then please do tweet us at STL Partners to share any thoughts you might have during the discussion. So now I would like to introduce our panelists and presenters. So firstly, we have myself, Reah. I am a senior consultant at STL Partners, and I will be moderating the session today. We also have my colleague Dalia, who will be joining the panel. Dalia is one of our directors and also heads up our edge computing practice. We'll be hearing a presentation from my colleague Patrick, who will be joining Dalia on the panel as well. Patrick is a senior consultant at STL Partners and will be sharing some key insights on the recent research that we've done, looking into why telcos need to evolve their IT systems for 5G. And finally, we're delighted to be joined by Andrew Keene. Andrew will be presenting and also joining the panel. He brings a wealth of knowledge from his previous roles at Matrix and OpenNet, as well as his current role as Senior Director of Product Management at VoltDB. And Andrew will be presenting on the need for real-time processing within this IT evolution for 5G. And just a reminder, following the presentations, we will be answering some of your questions, so please do submit them throughout the session. I will now, without further ado, hand over to my colleague Patrick, who will get us started with the presentation on what is this 5G opportunity and what does it mean for telco IT? How can telcos really capture value here? So over to you, Patrick.
Great, thank you very much. So as Reah mentioned, all of the information that you're about to hear is based on existing STL Partners knowledge, as well as a research program that we ran in consultation with VoltDB, with operators globally and vendors to understand the 5G opportunity, as well as how our operators positioned to address that 5G opportunity. So we are definitely in the era of 5G, and it comes at a time when telcos face a number of big challenges. Networks are being commoditized. There is pricing pressure being put on top of the network. Connectivity is purely seen as a means to an end, and this has been particularly exacerbated by new market entrants. For example, the hyperscale players such as AWS and Azure coming to market with connectivity solutions using their global cores to connect enterprises directly to transmit packets and data around the world. Moreover, telcos have really struggled with feeling a little bit trapped in the value chain, feeling as if they can't move up or down the value chain and are purely providing connectivity and maybe reselling some services from third parties. But 5G presents an opportunity for them to move outside of that traditional telco role. And this is by three key ways. First of all, it gives them a route to open into new industry verticals, playing in areas where they weren't necessarily incumbent by offering new use cases, differentiated use cases. 5G augments the capabilities of 4G and other connectivity solutions, but it also enables completely new use cases, for example, smart city traffic management. Moreover, 5G opens up the ecosystem to telcos, allowing them to partner with new players to create joint go-to-market solutions, bundles that they can give to their end enterprise customers. Now, 5G is not just an upgrade on 4G, and there is a danger in thinking as such. What we've seen through our thinking and through our research is that if 5G is considered just another mode of connectivity, another era, another generation of connectivity of 4G, then the revenues will stagnate over time and the value that can be driven through 5G may fall away. The key is all about driving those over-the-top services, those value-added services. In terms of the benefits that 5G brings to the table, it's much faster, multiples faster than 4G, and is much more reliable than 4G. There's been reticence in the market to use cellular connectivity as a primary or even a backup link due to the reliability issues to do with the wireless or cellular connectivity. 5G fixes that. In terms of security and control, 5G is that much more secure than 4G. Packets are naturally more encrypted traveling over a 5G network, but this is not to say you don't necessarily need overlaid security. It's just to say by its nature, packets are more encrypted. And there is also the opportunity of opening up for network slicing. 5G opens up the possibility for network slicing. And what network slicing is segmentation of the network to be able to provide services for packets of a specific type, traffic of a specific type to travel uncontended with other types of traffic. So for example, if you were in a manufacturing scenario and you wanted your mission critical traffic to run over a particular slice of the network, you could have that and separate it from the non-business critical traffic. Thirdly, there's an upgrade on flexibility. A lot of networks today that are reliable use wired connectivity. And if you're thinking about a campus network environment or a city network environment, using cellular connectivity that's reliable in 5G allows you to dynamically connect your devices and your sensors. So for example, if you had a factory scenario where you had a production line that needed to move around to optimize operations, or you had autonomous vehicles, to connect them with wired connectivity would be extremely cumbersome. But 5G can ensure that these devices can stay connected in a dynamic manner without too much hassle of reconnecting them with a fixed connection. And finally, 5G opens up new services. So I talked a little bit about network slicing already, but you can change the way that you actually charge the commercial models, the business models on top of that connectivity, on top of the network slicing. For example, charging on the basis of outcomes, on the basis of quality of service, for example. 5G has three core capabilities that it offers, and they're represented here in this capability triangle. Enhanced mobile broadband, which is all about just the pure speed that it provides. Ultra reliable low latency, which is all about reducing latency and lag and packet loss when transmitting data across the network. And massive machine communication, whereby 5G can connect hundreds and thousands of devices, for example, in a smart city, to make sure that data is aggregated and coordinated and processed all in a manner that is consolidated. And 5G enables use cases both across enterprise and consumer sectors. Now, from our research, we spoke to operators and vendors to try and understand their approaches to 5G and their levels of maturity in their programs. And we found there are kind of three core buckets. There are the nascent players, the maturing players, and the leaders. In the nascent players case, 5G spectrum is yet to be assigned in that particular market. And so it's very difficult for those operators to actually advance their 5G programs. There may even be a perception that 4G is good enough in that particular country. There are no use cases that require 5G. Then you have the maturing players, and that's where spectrum may have been recently allocated, and they may have already started doing proof of concepts of a non-standalone core. What we mean by this is a mobile core which is based on 4G technology, and then there's incremental builds on top of that to enable 5G services. And a standalone core which is purely new stack stood up may be deployed in more than 2 years. And then we have the leaders. These are players who have initial non-standalone solutions deployed, and standalone deployments are due to be deployed in the next 1 to 2 years. And what they're really thinking about is not just the connectivity. They're already connecting consumers in some businesses. They're thinking about what's the next step? How do we engage our customers for the value-added services on top? And they're engaging with technology vendors and other vendors from the ecosystem to try and make that a reality. There are three key drivers of that particular maturity. First of all, we already talked about the spectrum allocation. If spectrum has not been allocated in a particular market by the local authority, it's very difficult for a particular operator to be able to actually progress their program. And then we have two drivers which are focused more on the organization themselves of the operator. First of all is organization. So how are they organizing themselves? How is the hierarchy working together to make sure that the operator is pulling together the right people to create centers of excellence, to develop 5G programs, to run them as efficiently as they possibly can, and to create the new services in the best way possible. Particularly as we've seen with 5G and other programmable networks, IT and OT are converging, meaning that people who have traditional software expertise and people who have network expertise, they need to work more closely together. And you can achieve this in a number of ways. Either you create kind of agile, dynamically resourced teams, or you create consolidated teams, and this can certainly help in terms of developing the program. It may also be true that these organizations will need to look to hire externally or retrain existing employees. And finally, a technology transformation is required to help drive maturity. What is needed is to move away from that legacy IT, that inflexible IT, and create flexible, programmable, and also horizontal IT systems to be able to scale up their business as they grow and as their customers grow. I've already touched on some of the challenges that telcos are facing when it comes to transforming for 5G, but the key challenges that we have found through our research are laid out on this slide. First of all, legacy IT is an issue. So a lot of the systems that are deployed today for 4G and other network services are not currently delivering the flexible functionality needed for 5G. Moreover, we also touched on the skills shortage, or rather to say, even if they have the right skills, they're not deployed at the right place in the organization to be able to drive a 5G program properly. Third of all, we mentioned the pricing pressure and commoditization that we've seen in the network, and this has exacerbated issues around funding. So it's extremely expensive to be able to stand up a new 5G network, the investment required in all the technology, but then also to maintain that network. So funding is very difficult, and to be able to build a consolidated business case across all the systems that you would need to upgrade to provide 5G, that is extremely difficult to consolidate. Because 5G is an extremely nascent area, that's clouded clarity of a roadmap. A lot of operators have yet to figure out their strategy for 5G. They know they need to do something with 5G, but they don't know yet what to do. And so there needs to be an element of thought leadership to help them, guide them, to help take away from this overwhelming feeling within the operators. And finally, as already mentioned, there is an element of regulation whereby if spectrum has not been allowed to be allocated already, it's very difficult to move a 5G program forward. Now, through our program, we look to understand what are the key IT system domains that are affected by 5G, and they're detailed along the bottom of the slide. So billing and charging, policy control, service provisioning, partner management, customer value management, and fraud and security. And there are a key number of drivers as to why these systems need to change with 5G. And they're detailed on the left-hand side of the slide. Customer demands are changing. New business models are enabled by 5G. Network slicing and customization of the network is more important than ever before. 5G cores will be more programmable than ever before, and end customers will be able to program elements of their core network to optimize for their own operations. And therefore, the technology that the telcos have in place needs to be able to cater to that. The kind of consumption as a service models coming into play definitely have a big effect across a lot of the IT systems that we've outlined in our research, and it's been made clear through the interviews that we've done. And there'll be new revenue flows, new services that haven't necessarily even been thought of today that will definitely need to be considered in the future by operators. So finally, we move on to what CIOs should be doing in order to enable the technology evolution. First of all, from an organizational perspective, CIOs need to encourage greater cross-team collaboration. So that's the greater convergence between the network and the CIO teams to deliver the 5G programs, and also engender more of a DevOps agile approach while looking to skill up the existing employees and bring in appropriate expertise externally if required. Secondly, there needs to be more flexible network architecture. Networks need to be more open and transparent than ever before, not just for customers, but in order to enable ecosystem plays whereby telcos partner with new players, and they need to be able to onboard quickly and understand what's going on in the telco core and the telco systems to be able to enable kind of joint go-to-market solutions. And the technology needs to be able to orchestrate cross-functionally rather than in stovepipes like may be the case today. And finally, from a business enablers perspective, CIOs need to be working more closely with the business people, so the strategy organization, the transformation organization, and the product organization, framing 5G as an enabler for moving up the value chain and understanding what are the planned offerings that can be given to potential customers, and then how, from a systems perspective, will they be made a reality, working in concert with the product teams to drive this. So that's basically it in terms of my presentation. So now, just to highlight, we are publishing a report which will contain some of the knowledge that I've just passed on here, but it will contain more detail on what we've looked at and what we've talked about to operators and vendors globally, and it will be focused on recommendations for CIOs around what changes need to be made in the billing and charging space, as well as policy control. That will be published around January time. And obviously, we're focusing on policy control and billing and charging in this report, but if we were to publish another report, we talked about those 6 domains that we were looking at. These are the 4 remaining ones. So service provisioning, partner management, customer value management, and fraud and security. If you wanted to hear more about one of these 4 areas, which one would it be? There will be a poll that's launched in the webinar. So if you could take a minute just to quickly answer that, we'll just pause a minute while the responses roll in, and then we'll show the results just to understand what people are interested in. Okay, we'll just give it another second. Ooh. Okay, so the results are in, and service provisioning has come out top. With the following up is partner management, then fraud and security, and finally followed up at the tail end by customer value management. Interesting stuff. And now with that, I will pass over to Andrew Keene to talk all about sorry, one second, the need for real-time processing, and hand over to you now, Andrew. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick. If you could just get the slides back.
Are they not on screen at the moment?
No,
One second, let me just reshare my screen. Apologies for this, folks. One second, apologies. Can you see that now?
Yes, thank you. Okay. Right, yes, thank you, Patrick. So yeah, I'm going to take a few minutes to explore the topic of why 5G needs real-time, low-latency decisions, with a particular focus on charging within the IT BSS OSS stack. You know, even for the traditional postpaid subscribers or the B2B and the enterprise customers who would pay a monthly invoice, the notion is even for those that real-time decisions in 5G is important in the charging space. And note this also where low latency is now considered in single-digit milliseconds in the 5G domain. So the first sort of compelling reason that charging decisions need to be handled in real time for all service requests, regardless of ultimate payment method, is that the standards have changed. Previously, in previous generations, there were separate online and offline systems defined, and the offline charging platform was very vaguely defined in the standards, and typically would just be, collection of offline records from the network elements, running them through mediation and ultimately into billing. But now standards define this convergent charging system in the 5G space, and such that all online and offline charging requests need to be authenticated before service delivery. And that is this a valid entity, be it a human or a thing, accessing a service that they or it are authorized to do so and have the means to pay for it. This has to be done in real time, regardless of the ultimate payment method. If it's ending up on a bill on an invoice, but you still have to do this authorization in real time and manage the transactions with the network. Will expect a response from charging in real time in low millisecond latency. Another change in the 5G standards is that the various network functions no longer generate the CDRs that used to be used for offline charging and fraud and revenue insurance and other applications. But the charging function itself is now expected to generate these records. So regardless of ultimately how the transaction is paid for, the charging platform needs to interact with the 5G core in real time to keep track of session and usage and all the other various charging components that are possible in 5G in order to generate these records, even if it's not actually doing online charging. Furthermore, the converged charging system also has responsibility for managing policy notifications, so such as state changes. If, for example, you hit a threshold and throttling is acted by the policy function, in theory in 5G, the policy function should be stateless, with charging now responsible for managing the policy counters. And of course, that has to be done in real time. So all the decisions that impact policy need to be handled and managed in real time. Now, also customer experience is still key. Of course, it's key in 5G. That's not new to 5G. It's been important for a long time to provide customers with a transparent view of their spend and sending them notifications at the point thresholds are reached, not several hours later or even minutes later, but at the time that the transaction's occurring, you should be able to notify or see where you're at in your spend. And even managing everybody in real time allows for additional sort of propositions, again, not necessarily new to 5G, with mixed prepaid and postpaid offerings, family groups which have a component of prepaid or postpaid, or a postpaid subscriber being able to sign up for a prepaid promotion or whatever it may be. Just manage, and of course you still have regulations and anti-bill shock mandates that you have to manage this stuff in real time. Again, that component not particularly new for 5G. But what is new is the 5G core provides many new charging metrics and charging triggers, as they're called. So instead of just purely charging based on usage and sessions, the charging system now has access to a whole host more information off the core network that you can make charging decisions on. Access and location, for example, or slice selection. If maybe you charge a subscriber more for using a less populated slice for a particular premium service. And again, you need to work that out in real time and charge accordingly. Network performance and customer experience is going to be a charging input. If the experience goes down, maybe you charge them less. And that's all possible now with the 5G core. Again, in addition to the traditional session and usage charging that's been common in previous generations. But as Patrick has already said, 5G is much more than just faster 4G. Consumer connectivity has more or less become commoditized, and operators need to move up the value chain. Few consumers are going to pay more for more speed, and networks are already giving away 5G at no extra charge in many markets. And in fact, where I live in Ireland, one of the big operators' Christmas campaign is all about we're giving away 5G, and there's no additional revenue for that. It's just consumers in a lot of markets really aren't going to be paying more for basic connectivity at a faster speed. So 5G has to offer a lot more than that to the operators and to the propositions that are possible. But it's not all about consumers. 5G brings new capability that opens up new verticals and some of which are more sensitive to low latency decisions than others. And there's examples of them on the slide, and the same examples that Patrick showed earlier. So the operators themselves are not just selling connectivity anymore, but they'll be working with a number of partners to package up more complex offerings, with 5G making more complex business decisions possible to help drive operators up the value chain and provide more compelling propositions than was possible before in 4G. But these partners need to be managed and onboarded and handled in real time. Like, there could be hundreds, thousands of potential partners that could work with a 5G operator, and it's not plausible to manually manage those, to have a partner liaison individual that will onboard them, set up the propositions. These partners need to manage that themselves. As Patrick said, be able to sort of program the propositions they want, the characteristics the service requires from the network, and all of that needs to be managed in real time and charged appropriately. The operator may or may not own the end payment relationship with who the service is provided to. That may be owned by the partner, it may be owned by the operator, but regardless, that it still all needs to be tracked and managed in real time. So many of these new business propositions only make sense if acted on in real time. There are transactions in the network that you can act on and make business decisions to drive upsell or additional services that only make sense if you do it in the moment. The context needs to be right. And so contextual real-time decisions are very important in 5G. And as I say, much more data available to make these decisions than was possible in 4G. But also than that, many of the 5G sort of decisions will be made closer to the edge to allow for much lower latency responses back to the network. So you're going to have charging more distributed and decisions made closer to the edge than perhaps was the case in previous generations. But as Patrick has said, the network itself is going to be, sorry, I have skipped a slide there. So yes, the network itself is much more agile than in previous generations. Gone will be the days when an upgrade or a capacity expansion was an 18-month project to upgrade a particular node in the network that needed more capacity. You should just be able to spin up new nodes for the function that needs the capacity, and that decision should be automated and managed again in real time. Entire network slices can be spun up on demand, and these may include a charging function dedicated to the slice. If the slice, for example, is managing an entire MVNO, it will have its own charging function with the MVNO price plans and offers and tariffs in it, and that will be different to the mass market slices or other B2B slices. Some charging platforms may manage multiple slices. It's going to vary depending on the offering of the slice, but either way, the charging platform itself needs to be agile, and you need to be able to spin up instances and manage different instances of this in real time. As we've already said, it's 5G offers a lot more opportunity in the B2B and B2B to X space than perhaps just simply faster consumer offerings. And in with that, there'll be private networks and public networks and slices. So again, all of this needs to be managed and charged for appropriately. The network analytics for real-time feedback, again, a lot of the pricing or charging decisions will be made based on the actual experience received. And so real-time decisions based on what's happening in the network will be possible. So all of the agility then in having a dynamic programmable. Okay, yes, next slide, please. Sorry, the control function went a bit funny there. Yes, so all of this agility, the network agility, programmable networks and dynamic slicing and scaling of individual components that need capacity requires a change in how applications are built and deployed. And hence there's a lot of talk in the telco industry at the moment about cloud native. Now, cloud native promises many business benefits. And in fact, in the telco industry, there have been many iterations of promised change in standards, network functions virtualizations being a recent one. But actually, possibly for the first time, the telco industry is learning and taking standards and direction from other industries. The web scale players, the Googles, the Netflixes, the Facebooks have been using this technology for a long time very successfully. And now the telco, instead of trying to invent their own stuff, are actually building on wider standards used elsewhere in the IT industry. So cloud native is very real, and it's absolutely needed to provide the agility that we've just been talking about. And cloud native itself provides many business promises, expectations, and just a few of them here. So applications should be quick and easy to deploy and manage. And that requires the breakup of the monolith. As I said, you cannot have a sort of a capacity expansion now taking 18 months to expand the entire monolith. The monolith should be broken up into independently upgradable, deployable, scalable microservices. In that, also, many of the functions that were carried out by humans manually in cloud native should be automated. So things like auto healing if there's a problem. If a microservice dies, it should automatically heal itself and be, available for processing again when it's ready without any operations effort from a human. There's no alarms triggering and manual intervention anymore. And all change should be managed by automated CI/CD pipelines, as Patrick said earlier, with the principles of DevOps. Change should be much quicker and more rapid into telcos than they have historically been used to. You typically leave a system alone for a long time and only upgrade it when you really had to in the telco world. But in cloud native, the whole idea is that you do small incremental upgrades as and when they're available to individual microservices. But you do it automated through a CI/CD pipeline. So the upgrade itself is predictable. There's not a human manually doing this stuff at 3 in the morning. It's an automated pipeline that you know the results you're going to get. Another benefit then of cloud native is better optimization of the underlying compute nodes. Containers are much more lightweight than VMs, which has a number of advantages in that they're much quicker and easier to start. So you can dynamically add new services or scale pods or whatever it may be. But they also then make better optimization of the underlying compute nodes because you can put many pods on one worker node to get the most out of using that worker node. It's not like there's latent capacity somewhere in the monolith, but another part of the monolith is at capacity. With microservices, you can deploy them as needed and make better use of the underlying hardware too. And of course, cloud native does promise that you can deploy pretty much anywhere, not necessarily even in a public cloud. You may have on-prem private clouds as well as public clouds. Telcos are typically looking at multi-cloud strategies, hybrid clouds. So the applications themselves do need to be ultimately underlying hardware and OS agnostic. The containers should run pretty much anywhere. Next slide, please. However, with the promise of cloud native, there are some pitfalls that the telcos need to be careful to avoid, or at least understand. And the first one is, just because something runs in the cloud, that doesn't make it cloud native. You can, with some effort, you can get pretty much any legacy monolithic application to run in a public cloud. But if you do that, you're not going to get any of the benefits of the previous slide. So applications do need to be architected and built specifically to be cloud native and architected right. 5G needs resiliency. We've seen if you've got something like a medical procedure over 5G augmented reality, you can't have downtime. You can't have service loss. It's just not acceptable. Telcos are already used to charging platforms having 5 nines availability, but actually in the public cloud space, the regions themselves are probably only 3 or 4 nines at best. So if you're planning an outage and during that outage, during some kind of upgrade or major maintenance, what happens if those 3 nines availability, then you have an unplanned outage at the same time? Maybe 2 regions are no longer enough, or two traditional data centers if it's on-prem. Maybe you do need to consider this notion of more distributed computing, edge-based active deployment. So you've got 3 or 4 deployments of this application, any one of which can manage any transaction, so that there's always redundancy, and that you actually build on the knowledge that the underlying infrastructure possibly isn't as resilient as perhaps the old traditional on-premise telco deployments are used to. But that comes with its own problems. You need to manage replication and availability in all these sites and in all cases. So again, the applications need to be fit for purpose to be deployed in such an architecture. Now there are technical constraints as well in cloud native, particularly things like low latency, high throughput systems like online charging, soon come up against. And one of these is that there's one containerized network interface for all pods running on a worker node. And in the public cloud, maybe you don't know what other pods are running on that worker node. So you don't know what workloads you're sharing your network interface with. And likewise, CPU scheduling across the pods on the worker node. And so we have seen in examples of real-time charging benchmarks run in public clouds where the problems have arisen of these natures. But there are solutions to those. CPU pinning, SRIOV for network interfaces. Just to say that the application needs to be architected right to be cloud native. It's not a case of just lift and shift the legacy application into the cloud and think that you're going to benefit from all the cloud native promises. But if it's done right, you absolutely will. And the final thing to consider, I guess, is in the cloud native space is horizontal scaling versus vertical scaling. Is more smaller nodes that you can incrementally scale horizontally perhaps better than fewer large, vertically big pods. I think that the promise of cloud native assumes that you can scale more pods as needed, which again only works if the application is architected right. And so with that, yes, apologies that the slide control went a bit wrong there in the middle, but with that, that's me, and I will hand back to Reah. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. Some really interesting things that you've covered there that I'm sure we'll dig a bit deeper on now during the Q&A. Just a reminder to keep submitting any questions that you have. As I said, if we don't get to them in this live session, we'll do our best to answer them offline as well. Before we dive into the Q&A, we would like to get your thoughts on another poll. So this poll is, what is the biggest challenge when it comes to evolving telco IT systems? So you should see that poll flashing up on your screens. So is it about more of the organizational challenges? So, the need to upskill, as Patrick mentioned in his presentation, or, maybe even having the ability to push transformation internally, because obviously stakeholders have different pain points and objectives. Is it more about the technological challenges and dealing with legacy systems? Or is it more commercial? Is it about proving and justifying the business case to actually make these investments involving IT? So we'll give you just a few seconds to select your answer. Okay, so it looks like half of our respondents have selected organizational, relatively closely followed by business. And that's interesting. I mean, we're hearing that even with 4G, a lot of operators were bringing in some level of cross functionality, particularly between the network and IT teams, and especially with 5G, even having them work as more of a unified team. But one of the big challenges that still remains is really upskilling and making sure that telcos have the right in-house skills to support some of these changes, or even outsource where needed. And then I guess one of the things that kind of relates to being able to justify the business case as well is that you've got stakeholders like the CFO team, for example, who really will need to understand the kind of monetization opportunities, before being willing to invest. So thank you for giving us some feedback there. I'll now invite all of our panelists to turn on their cameras, ready for the discussion. And I think we'll kick off with our first question. Off the back of the poll results, it would be interesting to hear from our panelists on, how we think that operators can start to overcome some of these challenges, particularly organizational, since that's what's come out of the poll. Maybe Andrew, you could sort of kick us off with some initial thoughts.
Yeah, I think actually the poll answer is very interesting because my experience, I have worked in an operator many years ago as well, and one of the biggest challenges absolutely was organizational. With siloed networks and IT and other parts of the business, it made big transformational change very, very hard. And in fact, a lot of programs ultimately failed, and they were mostly organizational failures more than technical. So it absolutely is a key area that the CIOs or whatever are going to have to address and make sure that as they seek to bring IT and networks much closer together, as Patrick said in his presentation, it's critical they do that, either by combining literally the organizations of them and mixing the teams up, or somehow collaborating them to work better together. Now, I've seen examples of operators that have done that they've literally combined networks and IT teams into one team and mixed up the management and the team construction so that they are literally forced to be joint. Very few, I haven't seen many do it, but certainly some have, and it's certainly something to consider. But if you don't, you do end up in a lot of trouble if you can't solve that problem, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would definitely echo that point, Andrew. I think one thing that telcos need to be aware of is that organizational change is not going to be an overnight change. So you may make, from a kind of a structural perspective, you bring the teams together, but actually ways of working and making sure that the relationship is as efficient as possible, that is not going to be easy. There are going to be growing pains. So it's all about trying to enact that change now to, I guess, get you ready to really serve 5G at scale in the future.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add one thing, which is, I suppose there's one thing to merge teams together, but another thing to maybe kind of equip the right team with some of the underlying skills and knowledge. And I think essentially what's happening is telecoms operators, as they move to more software-based networks, there's a need for those who are running the network and operating the network and making decisions on the network to have those kind of software-based skills. So some of that is happening, organically, and I'm sure there are big training programs and recruitment drives. Some of that does also face challenges. I know we've heard from some telecoms operators, there are some quite practical challenges with just recruiting people with software skills to a telecoms operator, because usually those types of people don't think of a telecoms operator as, maybe a software-based business as much as a car provider or an internet company or a Facebook or whoever. So those are some, real challenges that they face, but in some, to some degree, it's happening organically as well.
And we've had a couple of questions about, I guess, some of the complexities that B2B and some of these even new business models will bring to IT that maybe we haven't really seen with B2C. And obviously there are going to be different implications for different IT systems. And if we think about billing, for example, some of these more complex B2B2C solutions could mean multiple partners involved in providing elements of the solution, and that can bring some complexities to billing and managing revenue shares and things. But Dalia, it would be interesting to get your thoughts on that question of, what we're seeing changing with B2B from an IT system perspective.
Yeah, I think the reason why there's so much focus on B2B is, I think, like Patrick said in his presentation, that's where the industry sees growth, right? Because to some degree, B2C is plateauing. I think there's some innovative operators who have, trained their market to kind of buy data based on speeds and maybe eventually latency as well. So you have, all you can eat bundles, but you pay a different price depending on what speed you get, and that will have some implications on, billing, I guess, especially, and how you can guarantee that that level of speed or that quality of service. So that's, one area where maybe in B2C there is an impact. But generally, like you say, it's from B2B. And I think there's probably two main areas which will impact billing and charging, and they're quite different. So one thing we've heard a lot is that there's this desire for telecoms operators, or at least some of them, to become more general sort of ICT solution providers and provide services that go high up the value chain. And that will be, a lot of that will be about stitching together services from partners, because the telecoms operator can't do everything. So you might get, cloud infrastructure from a cloud provider, and you might have applications from independent software vendors, that, et cetera, and that will make a much more complicated solution that you're, taking to market, and you're having to, monitor if you provide a managed service. So that has implications on your, your IT and your service assurance. And then there's also the billing aspect. So it's more complicated billing wise, because it's not as straightforward as a normal kind of connectivity product. So that's one area. And I think the other area is what we've talked about a little bit already, is kind of this move to network slicing or network as a service. And I think that's where there's more of an implication on charging in particular, and how you can have a real-time view of the service and therefore charge for it. Basically, as soon as it happens. And I think that's, it's going to be particularly challenging. It's going to have a particular impact when, we move to sort of dynamic network slicing, where you may, as a telecoms operator, have to provision and set up a specific slice for a specific workload or application in real time, and then be able to monitor that and charge for that immediately. So that's where there's going to be a complete change, I think, in how charging works because of this move to a certain type of B2B service or business model.
Yeah, thanks, Dalia. And we've had actually a couple of questions come in as well, kind of deep diving on this question of charging. And one of them I think has come off the back of your presentation, Patrick. Would you be able to just explain a little bit more about, what we mean about charging based on outcome, and even from a slicing perspective, how is slicing really going to impact charging? It's not just going to be charging on usage. So maybe if you could just expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Andrew touched on it in his presentation as well. I think in terms of the types of charging that you would see in terms of the outcome-based charging, just beyond kind of what's the general speed that you'll be getting, it really depends on the customer priorities, and some of these metrics are yet to be thought of or even implemented. But if we take an example for network slicing, you could charge on the basis of quality of service. You could charge on the basis of kind of guaranteed percentage packet loss, for example. You could even, in the network, depending on what the end enterprise decided to do, would be charge on the number and the basis of kind of successful API calls as well, or successful voice over IP calls. So, you could, in theory, say the sky is the limit in terms of the type of outcomes that you could charge on the basis of. And as I mentioned, because of this kind of openness and the endless world of possibilities, there is tends to be a kind of a lack of clarity within operators as to what they should do, what are the metrics they need to be charging. But I think it's all about operators really getting into the nitty-gritty, understanding of, what do their customers need, what do their customers want, and therefore aligning the charging models to what the customer really needs.
Yeah, yes, there are a lot of questions obviously about, how to charge with things like slicing, but I guess, it really is an opportunity for operators to kind of monetize their networks in new ways. And we've got another question here where someone said our market is mostly postpaid or enterprise offline charging. So why is real time important to us? I think a question for you there, Andrew.
Yeah, and it's a good question, and one you hear, because actually, certainly in Europe, you would assume that even postpaid is managed in real time, so that you don't have bill shock, or when you go roaming, although maybe not so much of that happening these days. But there are parts of the world where actually, postpaid charging isn't there. There is no real time part of it, and you just get the bill, and that's that. But as I said earlier, I think because the decisions that you can make to charge people on are going to be more dynamic in the 5G world. As Patrick said, the charging may vary depending on the actual quality of service they're receiving. Now, of course, you can still give them a bill at the end of the day, but it's not very user-friendly when you have no idea what you're going to get charged until the end of the month. And so even I think if the enterprises where there's much more scope for propositions based on metrics in the network that simply weren't available in 4G, to have just the transparency of exposing what's happening in real time is really valuable. Say even in the enterprise space where they will ultimately pay the bill, but I think you do need to be able to expose to them what's happening throughout the billing period in real time, and also the technical elements I mentioned in my presentation about the standards expectations of the charging platform has to respond in real time to the network anyway. So if you need to be managing even offline charging events to the 5G core in real time, it makes sense that you can actually transparently show your customers what's happening in real time as well. And it is just a much better customer experience. And then, as I say, that there's the opportunity to have a mix better offerings. If you've got a postpaid subscriber, maybe you can trial a service that's prepaid just as a one-off bundle kind of thing to tease them, to get them to upsell it properly. You can offer all that kind of stuff. If you're making your decisions in real time as to which bundle you're consuming from, and not just sticking it on a bill, it just gives the operator much more scope to offer better service to the end customer, say, regardless of what their ultimate payment method is.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, we've had a couple of questions come through specifically on telco partnerships in this space. And to what extent are telcos going for a multi-vendor approach for, the evolving these IT systems, and how much do we see that changing? So maybe Dalia, you could start us off, but Patrick, Andrew, feel free to jump in with your perspectives as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of desire and ambition to open up the vendor ecosystem, and there's been a lot of changes as well in the telecoms vendor ecosystem in the last, say like 2 years, even, or last year, with new players joining, and things like some of the efforts around Open RAN as well, further opening that up, plus the 5G core activity as well. And now we're seeing, the cloudification of OSS and BSS in the last couple of years as well. So that's all changing the vendor landscape. I think the reality is that these things take time generally to actually be seen in practice. And I think for a fair few of the telecoms operators we spoke to in our interview program, they definitely want that. They want the ability, almost a future proof, to be able to have a multi-vendor approach down the line. But probably in the short term, there's still it might be a kind of a cultural reason. There's also a kind of maybe a risk factor, because if you're used to dealing with a single vendor, there's always one company that you go to if you have a problem. And I think moving away from that is not always easy, but yeah, like I said, there's the steps are there. So even as a telecoms operator, if you're kind of your new architecture comes from a single vendor, it will likely be modular still, and so there is some level of future proofing, and then there's the ability to open things up and use other vendors. But I think in the short term, there will still be a fair proportion of the industry that goes for a more traditional approach, to be honest. I don't know, Andrew, if you've got a different view, you might disagree with that.
No, I think you're dead right. I think the operators obviously would love the nirvana of being able to not being held to ransom by any one vendor and being able to pick and choose. But and certainly you see it even in their infrastructure decisions, that they are mostly going with multi-cloud strategies and not just picking one and being then stuck with that one. But as you say, in reality, for many of the core functions, you're going to see them pick vendors that they're comfortable with for delivering those. And maybe on the periphery, you'll see them doing stuff in the IT space that's with new vendors and different vendors, or even building stuff themselves. Some of the bigger operators or the group operators are showing an appetite for building some of their own. But I think exactly as you say, though, for a lot of the core systems, certainly for the next while, you're going to see the known vendors in the mix there, and providing those kind of functionalities, I think, for some time.
Yeah, I don't know if you agree, but I think some things that are interesting going on, with things like private and dedicated networks. They're almost like a test bed for these multi-vendor scenarios, and so they're quite a nice way to look at alternative methods of building a network and the and the surrounding support systems, and testing that out for your closed user group, being your enterprise customers, and then as that starts to work, or there are lessons learned there, then implementing that, I guess, in the the public network or their main networks. So yeah, there's that happening at the same time as well.
And one thing that I just wanted to have a chance to ask all of you would be, what would you say would be the kind of next steps for the IT organization within the telco, the CIO team? What are the next steps that they need to take to prepare for this evolution? Would be interesting to hear from all three of you, just kind of a quick summary of what you think the takeaways are there. Maybe Patrick, you could kick us off.
Sure, all too polite. So yeah, I think already touched on it. Start thinking about driving convergence between your team and the traditional network team, and help the adoption of those DevOps processes that maybe your team is more comfortable with. Drive them into the network teams. Think about, on the whole, the current skill sets that you have in the business. Obviously, from what we've heard from the poll, organizationally, that that's one of the key barriers to transforming for 5G. So clearly, that the organizational piece is absolutely key. And then get in a room with the business folks, with the product teams, to understand those customer needs, to make sure that you're driving an architecture, a horizontal, flexible architecture that meets the needs of the customers.
Yeah, exactly.
Can't really add more to that. Yeah. Great summary, Patrick.
Yeah, but I think that you're dead right. But I think the operators, they need to really grasp straight away that, yeah, 4G to 5G is wildly different to 3G to 4G, and the standards and the skill sets and everything are all changing. So instead of the proprietary telco protocols and stuff, telcos are now, the standards are adopting things that have been in the IT space for some time. So the natural sort of merger of networks and IT anyway, by the skill set you're going to need, but it's going to take planning, and it starts by the acknowledgement that it's happening and that you need to deal with it, that it isn't just an incremental upgrade like previous generations were. But if you're really going to benefit from all the business value and the going up the value chain and all of that and getting the return on investment, you need to do it right. And as Patrick said, that from the architecture, the flexibility of what you're deploying, getting your cloud strategy right, and the organization of your teams as well.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think, and just to emphasize the need to start to think about, the kind of commercial side of the implications of 5G core, because I think a lot of the innovation is happening in the technology teams, which is great. And, there's always a need for that. But at the same time, it needs to get to a point where someone who's going to take something to market to these enterprise customers, where there's going to be all this growth, to say, this is what I need from a requirements perspective, and this is how I feel the service is going to work. So I think, Patrick mentioned it, this kind of joining up the business teams or the product teams with the technology teams. So I think there's something there that needs to happen. It's not just about, IT and networks converging, but it's not necessarily convergence of the commercial teams with the technology teams, but at least a bit more of a, kickstarting that kind of two-way innovation, so that telcos get a bit closer to understanding what they can actually do with this new functionality, and trying to move away from just a kind of test bed or proof of concepts or trials, and getting something a little bit closer to what might look like the real B2B services they take to market.
Great, thank you so much. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I would like to thank all of our panelists, and I wanted to just steal the last couple of minutes to share a final poll before we wrap up. So we are hoping to have a part 2 of this webinar as we continue our research on the topic, but we'd be interested to hear from all of you, our audience, as to what you think would be the most interesting topic for kind of part 2. So we should see this coming up on our screens now. So would you be most interested in seeing more of a system deep dive that focuses on some of the systems that we've pulled out in the report that Patrick mentioned? So one thing that we thought could be interesting is how policy and charging are converging to meet some of these changes and opportunities that we've discussed. Or would you be interested in more of a deep dive specifically on slicing and what that could mean for telco IT? Or would you like a bit more of a region-specific analysis to find out, more about trends within your region and how that compares to other regions? So I think we'll just give you a few seconds to vote on that. Great, so pretty big majority there in favour of network slicing. So I can promise that we will probably have a part 2 coming up focused on that. And it's an interesting topic for us as well, and something we've been thinking a lot about, particularly for policy and charging. Even though it's still a couple of years away as an opportunity, it's definitely something that's top of mind for a lot of operators in this context. So all that's left for me to do is remind you all that we will be sharing the recording and slides, so please do feel free to circulate, as well as responses to any unanswered questions. And I'd like to say thank you very much for joining, and thank you to all of our presenters and panelists, Dalia, Patrick and Andrew. So goodbye everyone, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.